Okay, so finally let's get on to rendering in Solaris. So to start, let's go over into our stage context here. And there's a few ways to do this. So we can start with a scene import, and I'll just choose the regular scene import where we can choose all of our objects to import here. So we can even bring in our lights, but let's just bring in everything except for our scene lights. Let's change our build here to Solaris. All right, so now we can just look through our camera. Okay, so now we're going to need to add a Karma render settings, and then a USD render ROP below. And then we'll also add a material library. So first of all, in our render settings here, if we go to limits, the volume limit we're going to need to set for our clouds will be a maximum of 32. And this will be a maximum bounce limit that most any clouds are going to need. And also if we go down to sampling, we'll see the volume step rate. So this will be the main factor in determining the quality of your volume itself, and this will greatly reduce or increase render times. So if we reduce this to a value of 0.15, we'll have quite a faster render, but we'll lose some of those details in the volume. So just to know for future, we'll keep this as default, and we'll just increase the volume limit. And then let's render with the XPU engine. Make sure we've got our camera 1. Great, so now let's just take a look at our render settings here, and let's add a light. Let's add a Karma physical sky. I'm going to choose a solar altitude of about 66 and 40. And actually, I'm just going to take out some of the clouds here and make it quicker. Let's just choose the hero left and the hero right, so we can work on those. But also in the Karma sky, I want to increase the base exposure to a value of 1.5. And then in the sky tab, in the base here, I want to boost this overall by about 1. I think I'll increase the horizon blur to about 10. Okay, so we might change some of this going forward, but let's just add a basic material. So in the material library, let's add a Karma cloud, and let's keep everything as default, and let's just assign this to our objects here. So right here is where we can choose our Karma cloud material, and then let's assign this to the geometry, and we can choose here what geometry to assign it to, or we can just give the asterisk and assign it to everything. So the first thing you'll notice with the cloud material is that our two different scales of clouds are quite a bit different. And so obviously with massive clouds in the back and smaller clouds in the foreground, the settings already are going to need to be changed quite a bit. Okay, so I've gone ahead and done a few example renders here, and I've switched this back to the build viewport here because I like to view a little bit more of our scene view. So we can switch this back to the Karma. But if we dive into the cloud material, everything is set up by default to render great clouds. The one thing based off the scale is definitely going to be the density value here. And depending on the clouds of your scene, we're going to need to adjust this quite a bit with the huge BG clouds and then the smaller foreground clouds. So we're going to need to increase the density. And the scattering is all kind of based off an expression here. If we go to the material properties, we can see the volume limits here. This is all kind of tied in to the density value, so it adjusts it accordingly. So in the Pyro shader, and we've got a few options here. Basically, the anisotropy is going to determine the angle of light scattering into the fluid. So if we were to turn this down, 0.877 works great for clouds, but we could almost get more of a rim effect from the sun if we turn this down. And the roughness is going to determine if the light is going to be uniformly scattered within the cloud. So essentially, if we turn this up, we're going to get some more details in the shadowy areas. And then the extinction fall off is how fast the density will diminish within the volume. So if we turn this down to 0, essentially it's diminishing at 100%. And if we turn this up to a high value, the density is diminishing very little with each bounce, and therefore scattering kind of everywhere. So by default, this is also a great value to start with. Let's go through a few examples here, also on the render times. So here I've taken a render just with the scattering on, and this has come out on my machine at just over 3 minutes to render. And by turning the scattering off, this is what we get. And now the render time is already at 1 minute 18 seconds, so a lot faster, but also still looks really great. So the next one here, this has got no scattering, but I've increased the roughness to a value of 2 and the extinction fall off to a value of 0.5. So you can see how inside is starting to scatter a little bit more. And the render time has gone up to just over 2.5 minutes. So by increasing the extinction fall off and the roughness, we're going to increase the render time a little bit. And then finally, here in this render, I've reduced the volume step rate to a value of 0.1. So here in the Karma render settings, if we reduce this to 0.1, we're going to get a lot less details but a quicker render. So now we're at 1 minute and 15 seconds for this. It changes the look a little bit. And then the opposite value in this render, I've used a volume step rate of 0.5. And the render time shot up to 4 minutes 46 seconds. So you can see all the extra detail we're getting of the clouds here. So basically it's just a mixture of what you're trying to go for, and of course kind of battling the render times. So let's kind of go in and take a look at our cloud here. I'm going to keep the volume step rate at 0.25, and then I'm going to turn on the scattering. And at this scale of cloud, if we were to use a scatter of 1, it's going to be way too much. So because the scale is so large, I've found a value of 0.003 that works. And then also if we go down to the scatter channel here, you can see it's defaulted to scatter. We can change this to occlusion, and this will be using the occlusion pass that we generated just after we cached our clouds out. So going back, I think I'm going to keep the density at 10. And with the shadow density, we can kind of boost the shadows a little bit to kind of darken these areas. But also I'm going to increase the roughness to try to get some more detail in those areas as well, in the shadowy areas. So I'm going to increase this to 2. And I'm going to increase the extinction fall off to 0.5. And this is just my opinion for these clouds. Maybe I'll reduce that a little bit. So there's a starting point. So now that we have this, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate. Let's call this hero left. I'm going to duplicate this to hero right. Work on the other cloud and see what we get.